Imagine being trapped in the mountains, the snow piling higher than your cabin, the howling wind drowning out the cries of starving children. Days turn into weeks, the last scraps of food long gone. And then, when survival seems impossible, you're faced with a choice so unthinkable, it will haunt history forever. This isn't a horror movie. This really happened. This is the story of the Donner Party. Stay with us as we discover the extent man can go for survival. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss out on our next thrilling video. Now the story. The story of the Donner Party is one of the most infamous and haunting tragedies in American history. It is not simply a tale of pioneers lost in the wilderness. It is a brutal saga of ambition, miscalculation, endurance, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. What began as a hopeful journey toward a brighter future ended in starvation, desperation, and choices so horrifying that they would echo through generations. To understand how ordinary families ended up snowbound in the Sierra Nevada, resorting to cannibalism to survive, we must start where all great American journeys began, with a dream. In the 1840s, the United States pulsed with expansionist fever. The Oregon and California trails promised land, freedom, and prosperity for those willing to risk the dangers of the frontier. California, still technically under Mexican control, was advertised as a land of mild climate, fertile soil, and endless opportunity. George Donner, a respected 62-year-old Illinois farmer, and James F. Reed, a prosperous businessman with big ambitions, gathered friends and neighbors into a single wagon train. They were not reckless adventurers but families, fathers, mothers, and dozens of children. In April of 1846, 87 emigrants packed their wagons, kissed goodbye to the lives they knew, and set out toward the Pacific. For them, the trek was more than 2,000 miles of wilderness. Yet their spirits soared. America was moving west, and they would be among its pioneers. None could have imagined how that decision would end. The emigrants followed the Oregon Trail for months, enduring storms, swollen rivers, and sickness. But in July, just past Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming, they faced a choice. A young lawyer named Lansford Hastings had been promoting a new route in his guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. The so-called Hastings Cutoff promised to save 300 miles by slicing through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and skirting the Great Salt Lake before rejoining the main trail in Nevada. Hastings assured travelers it was faster, easier, and safer. What he failed to mention was that he had never personally led wagons across it. James Reed, eager for an advantage, convinced the others to take the cutoff. The choice would cost them dearly. The Wasatch Mountains quickly turned into a nightmare. The trail was nearly impassable, forcing men to chop through dense brush and carve roads with axes. Progress slowed to a crawl. The wagons creaked over rocks and ruts, oxen collapsed, and tempers flared. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had claimed it was a 2-day crossing. It took the Donner Party 5. The sun beat down mercilessly on the glaring white flats. Water vanished, cattle went mad with thirst, and wagons had to be abandoned in the endless salt. By the time they staggered out of the desert, they had lost weeks of precious time. Winter was closing in. Other wagon trains that had chosen the traditional route were already safely descending into California. The Donner Party was still hundreds of miles away, dragging weary bodies and broken wagons into Nevada. As if the trail itself were not punishing enough, human conflict added to the misery. On October 5th, near the Humboldt River, Reed quarreled with a teamster named John Snyder. The argument escalated into violence, and in the struggle Reed fatally stabbed Snyder with a knife. The emigrants convened a crude frontier trial. Some called for Reed's execution. In the end, they chose banishment. Reed was forced to ride ahead alone, exiled into the wilderness, while his wife Margaret and their 4 children remained with the group. Reed promised to reach California and send back help. It was another blow to morale. A leader gone, tension rising, and the mountains looming ever closer. By late October, the party finally reached Truckee Lake, today's Donner Lake, nestled at the base of the Sierra Nevada. Ahead lay the final obstacle, crossing the mountains into California's Sacramento Valley. But fate struck one last devastating blow. An early blizzard blanketed the passes in snow, so deep that wagons and livestock could not pass. Again and again the emigrants tried to force their way over the mountains. Again and again they were driven back by storms and towering drifts. They were trapped. The emigrants built crude shelters. At Truckee Lake, 3 cabins were thrown together from logs and branches. 6 miles back at Alder Creek, the DONNAR families, delayed by broken wagons, erected tents covered with hides. At first, they slaughtered their remaining oxen and cattle. Meat was rationed, and families tried to hold on to hope. But as December approached, the food dwindled. They boiled hides into a gluey soup. They gnawed on leather and chewed bones until nothing remained. Children cried from hunger, then grew silent. Snow buried the cabins deeper and deeper. Hunger clawed at them relentlessly. Something had to be done. On December 16th, 15 of the strongest emigrants set out on snowshoes in a desperate bid to reach California and bring back help. They carried little food and fewer supplies. The mountains swallowed them in silence and cold. Days turned into weeks. Snow blinded them, frostbitten feet bled, and their meager rations vanished. One by one, the weakest collapsed and died. At last, faced with certain death, they made a choice no human ever wishes to face. They consumed the flesh of those who had perished. It began reluctantly with prayers and tears, but soon it became the only way forward. They roasted strips of human flesh, dividing it carefully. Of the 15, only 7 staggered out of the mountains in January 1847. They brought back the horrifying news. Dozens were still trapped, starving in the Sierra Nevada. California settlers quickly organized relief. James Reed, true to his vow, was among the leaders. The first rescue party reached Truckee Lake in mid-February. What they found was beyond imagining. Gaunt, hollow-eyed figures shuffled out of cabins. Children huddled naked under rags. Bones and human remains were found among the snow. Survivors did not deny it. When starvation had become unbearable, they too had eaten the dead. Relief workers carried out as many as they could, but many were too weak to move. Supplies were left behind and promises made to return. Over the following 2 months, 4 separate rescue missions fought their way into the mountains. Each time, more survivors were carried out. Each time, the rescuers were haunted by the sight of corpses half buried in snow, and the knowledge of what had happened. The Donnar's last stand. At Alder Creek, George and Tamsin Donnar remained trapped in their tent. George's hand had become infected, and he was too weak to travel. When rescuers pleaded with Tamsin to leave, she refused. She would not abandon her husband. She sent her children with the relief parties. They survived. She did not. By April, when the snow finally melted, searchers found only bones, hides, and the ruins of the camps. Of the 87 emigrants who had begun the journey, only 48 survived. Nearly half of them were children. The story of the Donner Party spread quickly across the nation. Newspapers feasted on the details, focusing on the grisly cannibalism. Survivors faced stigma, whispers, and accusations. Some refused ever to speak of it again. Others tried to set the record straight. Virginia Reed, James Reed's teenage daughter, later wrote to a cousin, "Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." Her words became a lasting warning for future emigrants. James Reed himself redeemed his reputation, having risked everything to save his family and others. Margaret Reed, his wife, was hailed as a pillar of strength. Against all odds, all 4 of their children survived. But the name Donner would forever be linked to tragedy. The Donner Party's ordeal became more than a cautionary tale. It became a symbol of the brutal realities of westward expansion. It revealed the dangers of reckless shortcuts, the merciless power of nature, and the extremes to which humans can be driven when survival hangs by a thread. Yet it is not merely a story of horror. It is also a story of resilience. Parents sacrificed for children. Strangers shared what little they had. People clung to faith even when death closed in. Today, Donner Lake is serene, framed by towering pines and granite peaks. Visitors picnic on its shores and paddle across its blue waters. But beneath its beauty lies a ghostly reminder of that terrible winter of 1846 to 1847, when ordinary families faced extraordinary suffering. The Donner Party set out to seek a new life. Instead, they became a legend of survival at its most desperate edge, etched forever into the history of the American West. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We have loads of interesting historical stories to share. See you on our next video.